Joint Commission, they're going to come and ask us, how do we clean it? And our proper answer is based upon the IFU. But if you think of that process, you have to remove your PPE when you're in decontam. You got to find a computer. You got to type in the web address. You got to type in the part number. You get to read the IFU personally, maybe 5 pages or up to 170 to try to figure out where your answers are. You got to comprehend it, memorize it, return to the decontamination. You're donning your PPE again, then going back to the sink and properly executing what you just retained. And again, that's for one instrument.
Millions of patients undergo surgical procedures every single day. They place their lives in the hands of healthcare providers who are committed to delivering safe, functional and sterile instrumentation for every surgery. Working behind the scenes are the technicians who go largely unknown, even to the patients whose lives are so dramatically impacted by their work. This is Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing. Join us as we explore this hidden world and introduce you to the unsung heroes who are driving the advancement of our profession. And now your hosts, Justin Poulin, Michael Matthews and Hank Balch.
This week on Beyond Clean, we speak with Andy Petrovich, President and CEO at Petrus. Andy founded Petrus when identifying that his personal sterile processing outsourcing company, along with most healthcare facilities, were not capable of protecting the patient by safely facilitating effective reprocessing of medical devices. Petrus was designed to combat common daily errors being performed in sterilization departments across potentially the entire globe. Prior to starting Petrus, Andy spent most of his career building healthcare startups and medical device service companies. He was raised in Michigan and graduated with a business degree in industrial distribution, marketing, and management. In 2000, Andy established Surgical Operations Services Incorporated and is the current president and CEO. SOSI is a sterile processing surgical instrument management outsourcing organization and provides surgical solutions for healthcare systems to obtain industry compliance managing labor, instruments, supplies, and repairs. We're going to dive into a deep one on this episode of Beyond Clean, Mike. We're going to talk about instructions for use, and I know we keep talking around the perimeter or the edges of this conversation in several episodes over the last few years, including one with Christine Green recently here in Season 3. But I will say this is an area where I think there's lots of room for improvement.
You know, you and I have both run into this a lot, talking about IFUs. You know, since we're both educators, that's something that we end up talking about almost all the time, is follow those IFUs. But we all know that there are problems with IFUs. There's some flaws in there. And so I'm really interested to dig into this one and see what kind of solutions are potentially on the horizon for cleaning up our systems of IFUs.
Beyond Clean. Joining us now is Andy Petrovich, President and CEO at Petrus. Andy, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Oh, my pleasure, Justin. Thanks again, Mike. I appreciate your time tonight, guys.
Well, we've had a lot of conversations on previous episodes that have dabbled into the world of IFUs, or instructions for use. We really wanted to bring you on to take a deeper dive. It's something that we thought we would address in an episode at some point, and here we are today. Definitely want to talk about challenges, maybe some technology, and the real-world application of compliance with instructions for use. So maybe we should just start off. I know most of the people listening to this episode know what the instructions for use are, because pretty much every in-service that ever gets done in a sterile processing department has that asterisk at the end that says, but remember, these general guidelines or recommendations, you still must follow the manufacturer's instructions for use. Every once in a while, I'll see somebody roll their eyes in the background. But, you know, from a legal standpoint, It's important. So let's set the table and just tell the listeners what the instructions for use are and give them an introduction.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I guess before we dive into this, I certainly wanted to thank Beyond Clean I think it's been a great addition to our industry and bringing education to the forefront. And with it's a very difficult sterile processing industry, and I think you guys have done a great job. So thank you on behalf of my team and our industry. We appreciate that.
Absolutely. Thank you for saying so. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Well, if I look at the challenges, the primary challenges, if I can kind of dive into this a little bit, although patient-centered compliance and quality assurance is spelled out in the IFU should be followed. That's just typical. That's the right answer within our industry. It is, unfortunately, it's just not the truth of daily habits or the practices within our professional sterile processing arena, unfortunately. I believe there's a false sense of compliance along with a high percentage of non-compliance. The complexity of the IFU industry, I think it's monumental. I often talk about climbing Mount Everest, and it's kind of like one step at a time. We can see the summit. However, the mountain continues to grow one instrument at a time in our industry. With my experience, guys, I've been exposed to anywhere from 300 to 400 surgical device manufacturers, over 500,000 instruments and devices. New items are being introduced annually, and old IFUs are changing. And I think it's only fair to say that it is a mountain, and it continues to be a mountain, and it's a challenge that we're all up against. And I think as an industry, we're going after it, and we're trying to tackle it the best way we can for the patient safety.
And really the results of non-compliance, I remember seeing something not only posted on LinkedIn, but shared with me, and obviously something recent in the news. I'm not going to go into details, but obviously some big hot topics and areas of focus have resulted in litigation over the last several years with a specific type of device. And there was, I think, points during the legal proceedings, if you read the overview of how they sort of assessed liability, they broke it down into 3 areas, and they kind of said, is the manufacturer liable for the way they manufactured the device? Is the manufacturer liable because of the way that they responded once they knew there was an issue? And then number 3, well, how much responsibility did the facility have in regards to the patient event? And so they kind of threw out number 1, mostly because the manufacturer had done all their due diligence, I think, with the 510K approval process. Secondly, there was significant liability on the manufacturer's end because they did not feel like the manufacturer had necessarily responded to informing end users that had purchased the equipment on the challenges in this particular situation and educating them and really putting that information out. But a lot of that liability was then negated because they said that the facility had not followed the original, however flawed, instructions for use. And so, that's really the result of non-compliance, right? Is that the hospital can wind up getting hit with legal bills. Is that a correct understanding in your opinion?
Oh, absolutely. I'd like to elaborate on that if I could. I think that's a great lead into maybe those that are not technically familiar with an IFU and what the purpose behind it is. I think for all of us in the sterile processing world, we understand that the IFU offers insight on each instrument. And I say each instrument, not necessarily just the manufacturers, because many manufacturers have multiple IFUs. The IFUs spell out what temperature of the water we're supposed to use, the type of solution, pH levels, exposure time within the rinse cycle, exposure time related to soaking the instruments, exposure time related to rinsing the second, third, fourth, or fifth time, depending on the instrument. It's also going to talk about the time that is required within the ultrasonic, the diameter of brushes needed, the amount of water needed to flush during the cleaning process. It's going to give you preventative maintenance recommendation. It's going to give you usage cycles. And lastly, it's going to give you the sterilization parameters. If you think of all of that, and that's just for one instrument. Now you look at what SPD staff, they simply do not have time to read these IFUs, nor to keep up with surgical demands. Although the online access or web, we'll call it the web, although it's powerful, the web simply does not have 100% of the answers. Now, if you really look at how an IFU is built, you add that to the lack of structure that has been created by the FDA or the expectations from the FDA. Manufacturers have no consistent format from one manufacturer to another. I've come across IFUs that are anywhere from 5 pages, and my largest IFU that I've ever been exposed to is 172 pages. You can imagine somebody in sterile processing trying to see and learn and visualize and understand temperatures and timelines. Unfortunately, just having that with one instrument, it's literally impossible. So with the FDA and the manufacturing, they're supposed to validate the stringent regulatory requirements for sterile assurance, which in our industry we call it the 10 to the negative 6. If I look at the complexity of IFUs, guys, I've witnessed incomplete, unclear, missing, or impractical IFU instructions. We're asking humans to know and memorize each manufacturer, and then they got to memorize each instrument, and then they got to remember the cleaning and sterilization process for hundreds of thousands of instruments. It's overwhelming, and I'm fair to say it's impossible. It's so complex, it's impossible.
Well, I got to tell you, as a former technician, that's actually kind of reassuring to hear you say that, because I know that oftentimes we've talked about before on the show how often, particularly from administration, the attitude towards reprocessing is, it's just like doing the dishes. You just stick it in the washer and then you stick it in the oven and it comes out good to go. But there's a lot more to it, obviously, than that. And I think that particularly when surveys come around, most surveyors kind of look for is, do you have access to the IFUs? And there's some good resources for that. I mean, obviously, at my first hospital that I managed, we did it manually, and we had a pretty good one. It was time consuming, but it was manual. But there's some digital resources out there. One source is perhaps the best well known, and it's a good idea. But is that enough to get us to compliance?
Great question. As I look at that, I'd have to break that one up actually into two ideas on that one. Although the online access or web, we'll call it the web, although it's powerful, the web simply does not have 100% of the answers, nor at times the correct answers. Again, as stated earlier, guys, I've experienced manufacturer websites for the IFUs that are incomplete, unclear, outright missing, impractical, items that are obsolete. I didn't mention that. And then potentially these items no longer exist. Manufacturers that have been bought and sold, manufacturers that have changed their names, and at times some of them have gone out of business. So it's an extremely difficult way for humans to learn and take action in the IFU world. So that would be kind of my first preface of kind of looking into the question of how strong maybe online access is. I guess part two of my answer would be having a subscription to the company that you had just mentioned, and them having access to so-called the IFUs on the internet is a false sense of security and simply does not address the complexity of the IFU world. Although it is a great source for most IFUs, the demand of compliance in our sterile processing industry has changed over the years. Here's my opinion, and I look at it as the online source that you had mentioned earlier. The biggest issue with an online subscription website access for IFUs is that it only allows you to research one instrument at a time. And if you look back in the old days, we used to have a black binder on the back desk, and we'd have to go find it within that big black binder. The online access, certainly websites have them. But again, the problem associated with that is you get one instrument. And I think it's fair to say there's not a tray out there in the country that is built with one instrument. There's typically 20, 30, 50, 100 instruments with multiple vendors and multiple IFUs all within that same tray. So if I look at the on-site ideas, it's great for researching one instrument at a time. If you look at the problem associated with that, Joint Commission, they're going to come and ask us, how do we clean it? And our proper answer is based upon the IFU. But if you think of that process, you have to remove your PPE when you're in decontam. You got to find a computer. You got to type in the web address. You got to type in the part number. You get to read the IFU personally, maybe 5 pages or up to 170 to try to figure out where your answers are. You got to comprehend it, memorize it, return to the decontamination. You're donning with your PPE again, then going back to the sink and properly executing what you just retained. And again, that's for one instrument. The problem within our industry is simply that. There is not a tray out there with just one instrument. So we feel that having access to one IFU at a time is, although important, it's insufficient for addressing the true issue of compliance related to IFUs and compliance to IFUs.
So, Andy, I want to backtrack on something that you've mentioned a couple of times, where you said that you've seen IFUs that were incomplete or just faulty in some way. Who is it that is actually responsible for approving an IFU?
Actually, I believe the process is the manufacturer designs the item, and then, of course, has to assemble and validate that item can actually be properly sterilized. They submit that into validation labs across the country. And the format, unfortunately, as indicated, it's not a similar format for every manufacturer. There's no written fill-in-the-blank concept with FDA, but ultimately, FDA receives this information, reviews it, validates it, and approves this item to be utilized within surgery or reprocessed, I guess is what they would say.
So then, if we are aware of one that is missing part of, a piece of information that's necessary, is there someone that we can reach out to? Do we go to the FDA? Do we go to the manufacturer? Who do we talk to?
You'd actually reach out to the manufacturer to try to get an updated, if they do have an updated version of that. So unfortunately, that is not necessarily the easiest as well. As indicated, some manufacturers have come and gone. They've been bought and sold. Items are obsolete. Sometimes part numbers are gone. As you can imagine, it's hard to find anything on a part number that doesn't exist.
Yeah, that is tough. And, the other thing is you talked about structure for the IFUs, but also, even before we get to structuring them, how come there isn't more of an effort to have sterile processing professionals involved in the writing of these IFUs to sort of speak the language properly? I feel like in a lot of cases they wind up getting somebody with a technical writing degree, which there's nothing wrong with that, but just because they understand how to write a technical document, it doesn't necessarily mean they know how to write a technical document for the audience. And, anytime, and I'm sure you've done some public speaking, you're supposed to know your audience before you go in and present information so that it can be related to and incorporated into their daily practices. And I feel like such a missed opportunity in many cases for the way IFUs are written today.
Yeah, again, another great question. Because of my background, I've been running sterile processing departments. I've been in my business model for about 18 years. Unfortunately, and we've witnessed it throughout those years, unfortunately, the sterile processing department is last in line to have any communication a lot of the times, even when a new product comes into the system after it was purchased. So I think the answer your question about why more sterile processing professionals are not involved with writing it, it's my opinion, sterile processing professionals do not make money for the manufacturers. We in our industry would prevent or slow down items to becoming available to market. We would add cost to manufacturing, potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars. And again, that goes against what the manufacturers truly want to do. So I think, unfortunately, the manufacturer designs an idea, approaches FDA, gets approval. From there, it's up to sterile processing to figure out how on earth to accommodate that IFU to the extent of the expected compliance that we are under demand of.
So, Andy, what kind of technologies are you seeing out there that are on the horizon that can help sterile processing groups overcome these difficulties to really start hardwiring compliance?
No, thank you. One of the things, the most important thing that I think has come to surface is an opportunity that we bring to the table now. It's our Petrus company. It's our Bluefin software solution. We're combating daily errors that are being performed in every hospital. I underline on every hospital in the country and possibly across the globe. We're about to change and improve our industry and related to managing IFUs. We're going to optimize and simplify this complex IFU industry through advanced sterilization software technology. And ultimately, we're focused on patient safety and outcomes in accordance to the IFU. Our software now allows a hospital to have as many instruments within their tray, having direct and visual access to temperature and water type solution, pH levels, exposure times to rinse and soak and rinses again, and ultrasonics and diameter of brushes, preventive maintenance, usage cycle, and lastly, sterilization parameters. We're going to have all that at the fingertips of sterile processing technicians around the country. It's a powerful system. It's an excellent way of aiming for true IFU compliance. It's written within ST79. ST79 is in the AAMI guidelines. AAMI, of course, has written these guidelines for us to follow within our industry. Bluefin allows traceability of documented transparency, which, of course, is, I think, a big flaw within our industry. We typically have always shown in our industry how to sterilize something, that we've met the parameters on temperatures related to sterilization. To date, there's been no company that actually proves any of the cleaning process. So we now have that with our Bluefin solution. We're going to allow you to properly have the temperatures and pH levels and duration of times. Parameters are going to be met and all the details are required. Again, we'll be at the fingertips of the professionals sitting at the sink and as sterilizers as well. Manufacturer IFU instructions are mandated by the FDA, AAMI, the Joint Commission, AORN, and CMS. I feel that if you look at some of the direction that AAMI has gone, they've actually assembled a working group called WG12, and their intent behind this WG12 is simply to try to figure out these IFU, the complexity, and try to put things into categories or buckets and make it a little bit more efficient for us in the industry. With our software, you no longer need that. We will be able to tell every hospital, no matter how many instruments, how many manufacturers, and how many IFUs are in that tray, our software will be that solution and give them the answer that is required.
It's interesting because so much would help this, and even your efforts, I would imagine, with structure similar to what they did with the safety data sheets and providing a regular structure for chemicals, et cetera, that are going to be, used in the department. But one promising or potentially promising area that's being advanced today, you talk about the work groups and et cetera, but really UDI regulation. And I know it's not really targeted to solve more of this like immediate communication and access to data because of the structure that it's provided to us, but UDI stands for Unique Device Identification, and there's all kinds of requirements, and we're in the midst of early phase implementation around the globe. But one of the things that it's supposed to house, and essentially you give each device an identifier, that identifier then houses a repository of information about it. And one of those bits of information would be the instructions for use. So I'm not sure that it breaks the structure down as much as it just says, it has to kind of line back. You talked about manufacturers that have or item numbers, et cetera, model numbers that have disappeared from the market. This would certainly give you a repository so that information wouldn't just disappear into the abyss. It would be eternally available, which is a good thing. But how else might it help?
UDI is an interesting subject that we're all working towards. I think the FDA has expectations of 2020 or 2022, I believe. Sorry. I think the UDI is an important process that will aid in the management of the asset, if it's an instrument or a piece of equipment within our sterile processing department. And again, I believe it's going to aid in managing that item. It will offer transparency and traceability of the asset, but unfortunately, it will not support transparency in meeting any IFU parameters in reprocessing. Again, it may give you the IFU, but again, that's going to be one instrument at a time. I don't believe a UDI is going to solve the complexity of mixing numerous manufacturers or vendors, numerous instruments, and numerous IFUs. Again, the UDI is going to be specific to that instrument. And again, we have trays that have hundreds of instruments on them with different manufacturers. So we will still need a different type of software to solve the concerns with management of IFUs. I don't believe UDI is going to be that solution. I think it's going to be a great resource to have access to an IFU, but again, it will not solve the complexity of multiple instruments, multiple vendors, multiple IFUs. I believe Petrus and Bluefin is the only answer today that will aid in that, not a UDI idea.
Well, it's a fascinating topic, and I think hopefully there are continued advancements. It sounds like your solution is going to help immensely. I mean, essentially aggregating data and combining it. And I think that's so enormous when you look at all the different instruments that are going to be in one set. So I appreciate you sharing a little bit about your solution with our listeners and also taking a deeper dive into the instructions for use world, which I think has a lot of opportunities for improvement. And, you know, what you described about why we haven't involved sterile processing professionals in the writing of those documents is actually, I don't want to say your answer was horrific, but the reality of that answer is horrific.
Yes. One of the things, guys, we did not officially talk about was the results of non-compliance. I believe FDA kind of states it clearly. The risks associated with deferring from the IFU is very high. As mentioned, FDA, AAME, Joint Commission, AORN, CMS, they all have guidelines sharing the importance of adhering to the IFU. And it clearly says if the IFU is not followed, the outcome of sterilization would simply be guesswork in my book, or in my opinion. The results of noncompliance, the results of noncompliance, I'm going to go ahead and list a few, I think a list of these that I feel would be pertinent to truly understanding the severity of a noncompliance concern with an IFU. Lack of industry best practices for the patient. We do see an increase in surgical site infections, or SSIs, increased liability for the hospital, poor patient outcomes, poor and inconsistent training within the department, increased costs associated with repairs and replacements when IFUs are not followed. A hospital can receive citations from Joint Commission. They can fail their accreditation. And lastly, the negative marketing publicity throughout the industry would just devastate a facility. Our sterile processing departments really, truly have to stop the excuses. And again, I run a department, I have for years, or many departments, and unfortunately they have to stop the excuses such as you don't know, you don't care attitude. It's the way we've always done it. It's how I was trained. These are simply just poor habits, and it's not good enough to meet and exceed the patient-centered compliance that is deserved and that we're expected to deliver. So I think there's a lot of things that have to change or help us. And again, looking at just solutions for these IFUs and trying to simplify it would dramatically make an impact to the patient and the outcome, as well as the facility that it impacts.
Well, certainly it's very serious stuff. You know, I'm not sure everybody out there always sees that bigger picture either, Andy. So thanks again for coming on the show and sharing that. I mean, we need to pay more attention to this, and there needs to be more improvements in this area.
Well, thank you again, guys. I do appreciate it.
That was Andy Petrovich, President and CEO at Petrus. And we talked a lot about instructions for use and those challenges. I think the biggest thing that stood out to me from this interview, Mike, was the fact that what Andy said about not involving sterile processing professionals intentionally with the instructions for use, if that's true, I find it very disturbing.
Yeah, why wouldn't you want to get the input of the people who are actually doing the cleaning of the instruments? I mean, it just makes so much sense. And honestly, the fact that it's ignored really feeds into the mentality that so many sterile processing departments kind of develop over time, which is we're the ignored department. Well, I mean, when the very manufacturers who are going to be utilizing your services ignore your input, well, it's kind of hard not to come to that conclusion. So it's a horrible oversight. It's something that really needs to be rectified in the near future.
Yep, couldn't agree more. But that's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to Beyond Clean on iTunes or Stitcher, and now also on Google Play and Spotify. Simply search for Beyond Clean Podcast. We'd appreciate a rating and a review because your feedback is important to the show. If you have a future topic that you'd like us to cover on another episode, or if you'd like to share a picture anonymously on our Instagram page, just send an email to info@beyondclean.net. On behalf of Hank, Mike, and myself, thank you for listening to another edition of Beyond Clean.